The facility was not on Ssyven's itinerary. She had reviewed the original schedule 3 times on the transit from the delegation quarters, hospitals, a civic center, a secondary educational institution, a public library, productive sites, manageable sites, places where human social behavior could be observed within legible institutional frameworks. The hospice had appeared on her confirmation documents at 0600 that morning, inserted by what her liaison was now describing with considerable distress as a clerical error involving 2 facilities whose names shared a partial phonetic overlap in the translated directory. "I can reschedule," the liaison said. He was a young human male who had introduced himself as Piotr and who had been apologizing continuously for 47 minutes. "It's really not the kind of facility we'd normally, it's not representative of." He paused. "I'm sorry, I'll call ahead." Ssyven looked at the building. It was smaller than she had anticipated. 1 story, pale brick, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that had passed their summer peak and were moving into something quieter, rust and amber, the specific palette of a season preparing to conclude. There were flowers she did not have names for. There were birds. A carved wooden sign near the entrance read Sycamore House Palliative Care Center in letters that had been repainted recently, she estimated, based on the uniform depth of the pigment. "I will proceed with the scheduled observation," she said. Piotr looked relieved and then immediately looked as though he'd realized relief was the wrong response. Ssyven noted this in her annotation framework and walked toward the entrance. The interior confirmed her initial assessment of scale and recalibrated several others. Human medical facilities in her preparatory reading had been described as clean, purposeful, efficient, and this one was those things, but it was also something else. The walls held objects that had no obvious institutional function. Children's drawings framed behind glass or pinned directly to a corkboard, a painted wooden placard near the nursing station that read, "Every person here is someone's everything," in a font that had been chosen for warmth rather than legibility. There were plants on the window ledges, real ones, some of them flowering. The light through the south-facing windows came in at a long autumn angle and lay across the floor in a way that Ssyven's visual processing registered as aesthetically intentional, even though no aesthetic intention could have produced it. There was a cat. It was occupying a padded surface near the reception desk and regarding Ssyven with an expression of such profound and particular indifference that she noted it separately from the rest of the entry. Inventory. The nursing station smelled of something she couldn't classify, antiseptic under something warmer, something organic. Her Velthari filaments registered the combination and offered no useful precedent. She kept them close against her jaw. The nurse who met them introduced herself as Benedita Ferreira, led palliative care, and she shook Ssyven's upper manipulator arm with the confident grip of someone who had encountered stranger things than alien diplomatic attachés and intended to get back to work as soon as this interaction resolved. She explained that a volunteer would be accompanying Ssyven for the observation period. "Experienced," she said, "long tenure." The volunteer was already at the nursing station when Ssyven turned. Margaret Calloway was 74 years old, which Ssyven knew from the pre-visit documentation. In person, she was a small human woman with gray-white hair cut practically short, wearing a blue volunteer's vest over a cream-colored shirt, reading something on a paper form and making a small note in the margin. She looked up when she heard them approach, finished her note with the particular deliberateness of someone who completes things before beginning other things, and put the form down. She crossed the space between them and extended her hand. Ssyven offered her upper manipulator arm, the standard adaptation she had learned for human greeting protocols. Margaret shook it without hesitation. "Wonderful," she said. "I could use a second pair of hands." "I see you've got 6. The Velthari filaments contracted involuntarily, drawing tight against the underside of Ssyven's jaw. She recovered quickly. She had not been expecting humor. More precisely, she had not been expecting to be treated immediately as a participant rather than an observer. She told Margaret politely that she had recording equipment and intended to observe in a non-interfering capacity. Margaret said, "Of course," in a tone that indicated she had heard similar things from Ofsted inspectors and supply teachers and had found them equally theoretical in practice. Room 7 first. Gerald had a rough night. She was already walking. Ssyven followed. Piotr remained at the entrance, looking quietly grateful to have been left behind. Gerald Hoffman was 79 years old and dying of pancreatic cancer, and he had, Ssyven thought, the look of someone who was aware of both facts and had formed an opinion about the second one that he did not particularly intend to revise. He was thin in the specific way of long illness, not frail but refined, as though everything extraneous had been quietly removed. He had a paperback thriller on the bedside table, face down, and a half-finished cup of tea that Margaret moved without asking and replaced with a fresh one from the thermos she had apparently been carrying in her bag. 2 sugars. She added them before he asked. Ssyven positioned herself in the corner of the room with her recorder active and her annotation window open. She was, she told herself, invisible. Gerald looked directly at her. "You're the alien," he said, without any particular inflection. Ssyven confirmed this. He accepted the tea from Margaret. "Do your people play chess?" She told him the Velthari had several strategy games that bore structural similarities to chess. "Similar enough that I could beat you?" Margaret said. Gerald, and the fond warning tones Ssyven was already beginning to recognize as specific to their dynamic. Gerald said, "I'm just asking." He looked at Ssyven with something that was not quite a smile. Something more considered than that. "She's not going to crack, you know," he said. "I've been trying for 3 weeks," Margaret said, without looking up from the medical chart she'd lifted from the hook at the foot of the bed. "You haven't been trying very hard. You told me on Thursday you liked me." "I said you were tolerable," Gerald said. "That's not the same thing." "He told me I was tolerable," Margaret said to no one in particular, setting the chart back. "Second highest compliment I've ever received from him." Gerald settled back against his pillows with the satisfied expression of someone who had managed their morning adequately. The conversation moved, not toward anything Ssyven expected. They talked about a chess match Gerald had played in 1987 against a man named Derbyshire whom he had beaten on a technicality and who had not, in his view, ever fully accepted this. They talked about the thriller Margaret was partway through, whether the detective's methodology was credible, and whether Gerald's skepticism was based on genuine literary discernment or the fact that he had figured out the ending in Chapter 4. Margaret thought the latter. Gerald did not confirm or deny this, which was itself confirming. Ssyven annotated continuously. She was looking, with precision and training, for the exchange logic. Where did the benefit transfer? What was Margaret receiving? It was a classification framework in the Velthari cultural assessment system, ritual social maintenance, Category 4C, that covered voluntary interactions of apparent low reciprocal utility. She had used it for human behaviors before. She opened it now and held it against what she was watching. It did not fit. Category 4C assumed performance, a display of social positioning, a signal of community standing, a visible enactment of cultural values for an audience that would validate the behavior. What Margaret was doing was not a performance. There was no audience. Ssyven was present but had announced herself as a non-participant. Nurse Benedita passed the doorway twice and did not pause. The behavior, the tea with the correct number of sugars, the particular quality of Margaret's attention, the way she laughed at Gerald's jokes just enough, but not performatively. This behavior continued identically regardless of whether anyone was watching. Ssyven made a note. She labeled it Behavioral Anomaly 1 and moved on. The break room at mid-morning was smaller than the corridors had suggested it would be. A practical room, a kettle, a table with mismatched chairs, a notice board with a pinned cartoon that Ssyven identified as intended to be humorous without being able to determine why. A woman named Dottie was already there. Dottie was 68, a former librarian, and she encountered Ssyven with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her whole life for exactly this type of Tuesday. She began her inquiry while the kettle was still boiling. Could Ssyven's compound eyes perceive ultraviolet? What was the approximate field of vision? Was it true that compound eyes had excellent peripheral detection? Did the Velthari have a concept of soup? Because she had been wondering whether a liquid food with dissolved or suspended solids was a universal culinary development or specific to certain planetary chemistries. Had Ssyven read much human literature? And if so, what had she thought of it? And was there a Velthari equivalent of the novel as a form? Did Gerald know she'd brought him a crossword book? because she hadn't given it to him yet, and she was slightly worried he might not want it if he thought it was meant to keep him occupied, rather than just because she'd found a good one. Margaret managed this the way Ssyven imagined she managed a great many things, with fond exasperation, occasional redirection, and the specific skill of the teacher who allows a certain amount of productive chaos. Ssyven answered the questions she could, deflected the ones that touched on classified sensory biology, and then Dottie said, between the soup question and what would have been, Ssyven suspected, a question about Velthari music theory. Does your species mourn? The break room settled. It was not a silence anyone made. It was simply what happened after that particular word. Ssyven opened her resonating membrane to answer. What came out was her voice, and beneath it something that had not happened to her in 14 years of professional practice, a second tone, faint and discordant, vibrating in the same cavity as her words but not of them. A resonance skip, in a hospice break room on a Tuesday morning. She finished the sentence she had begun. We concluded that mourning was not productive. The words were correct. The tone beneath them had already said something else. Dottie looked at her for a moment. Then she said softly, "Oh, sweetheart," in a voice that was not pity. It was something quieter and more careful than that. Something that somehow landed harder precisely because it wasn't pity. Margaret did not say anything. She looked at Ssyven for a moment, a specific look, not long, not analyzed aloud. And then she poured a cup of tea and set it in front of Ssyven without asking whether she wanted it. Ssyven looked at the tea. She had not catalogued this either. She drank it. Margaret agreed, without hesitation or apparent curiosity about Ssyven's reasons, to a structured interview during the quieter stretch of late morning. She sat across the break room table and listened to each question the way Ssyven suspected she listened to most things, fully, without preparing her answer while the question was still being asked. Ssyven worked through the cultural assessment framework. Social obligation. What community requirement does this behavior fulfill? Margaret considered it. None that I know of. No one would notice if I stopped. Reciprocal exchange. What does the volunteer receive from the interaction? Margaret thought about this one longer. I get to know people, I suppose. Gerald has been showing me how the 1987 championship circuit worked, one match at a time. I know considerably more about chess than I did in October. Status conferral. Does the community recognize or reward this behavior? Margaret made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The parking is free. That's about it. Ssyven pushed to the core of the question. But what do you receive in return? What is the net benefit to you of this investment of time? And I want to ask this carefully. Emotional expenditure. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Not defensively. Not as if she found the question offensive. As if she were genuinely trying to give it an honest answer rather than the easy one. I suppose, she said slowly, I receive the fact that I'm the kind of person who comes. Ssyven's manipulator arms began their unconscious alternating sequence. She felt them moving and did not stop them. She wrote the answer down. She opened 4 different classification categories and held each one against it. She closed all 4. The answer was not vague. It was not sentimental in a way that resisted analysis. It was coherent and internally consistent, and it was operating from axioms that were simply not present anywhere in her framework. She labeled it Behavioral Anomaly 4 and felt, for the first time in the day, that the label was not adequate, that no label she had was adequate, that her labeling system itself might be the thing that required examination. She did not write that down. She thought it, held it briefly, and then the early afternoon happened, and there was no space for anything theoretical after that. Gerald's pain came back hard at 2 in the afternoon, which Nurse Benedita told her afterward was not unusual. The medication schedule had a gap, and there had been a pharmacy logistics delay that pushed the next dose 40 minutes late. 40 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. In room 7, it was a long time. Ssyven stood in the doorway. She had been about to move to the corridor for another section of her observational sequence, but she stopped. Margaret did not panic. This was the first thing Ssyven noticed, and she noticed it with something that was not quite clinical detachment anymore. Margaret did not reach for anything she did not have. She did not pretend, did not say it would be fine or it would be over soon or any of the reassurances Ssyven's preparatory reading had flagged as common anxiety management vocalizations. She took Gerald's hand. She talked, not about the pain, she didn't avoid mentioning it, but she didn't circle it either. She talked about a bird she had seen in the car park that morning, which she thought might have been a fieldfare, though she admitted she wasn't entirely certain, and she was going to look it up later. She talked about a joke her grandson had told her on Sunday that wasn't especially good, but had made her laugh anyway, and she told Gerald the joke, and it wasn't especially good. And Gerald made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh before it became something more pained, and Margaret stayed with that too, not flinching from it, not rushing past it. She sat inside the pain with him. She did not fix it. She did not leave. Ssyven's entire body had gone still, not the artificial stillness of professional restraint, but the deeper stillness, the full processing state that she had not entered since the third year of her training, when a diplomatic incident had produced a threat-level input that temporarily overwhelmed her operational capacity. Her recording equipment was still in her hand. She noticed at some point that her arm had lowered. She could not identify when this had happened. The medication arrived. Benedetta came efficiently, administered, withdrew. Gerald's breathing changed, still labored, but easier, the specific ease of a body given permission to stand down. Margaret remained in the chair. Her hand remained in his. The conversation became quieter and then became silence, and then became the particular silence of a room where the worst moment had passed. Ssyven had stopped writing. She did not pick up her pen. She found Nurse Benedetta in the corridor 15 minutes later, which she had decided in advance was a clinician-to-clinician inquiry. She asked for the evidence base of the volunteer program, outcomes data, efficacy metrics, the measurable differential between attended and unattended palliative cases. Benedetta gave it to her without ceremony. She had the numbers readily available, which told Ssyven that she was asked this question regularly, probably by administrators. Cortisol indicators across attended and unattended patient cohorts. Reported comfort metrics from exit interviews with family members. Staff well-being differentials. The data was sound. Ssyven noted it, knowing she had already known something like it would exist, knowing also that it was not why she had asked. Benedetta paused. She looked at Ssyven, at the recorder, at the long notation document, at Ssyven's plating, which had gone pale in the afternoon light, closer to white than the gray-blue it had been that morning. "You're writing everything down," she said. "Does your species have anyone who just sits?" Ssyven did not answer. Benedetta's expression did not change to accommodate this. She waited a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was not unkind but landed with the weight of a thing plainly true, "Margaret said something to me once, maybe 3 or 4 years into her time here. She said the dying aren't afraid of the dark. They're afraid of being left alone in it." She went back to her patients. Ssyven stood in the corridor. She stood there long enough that the residential cat reappeared at the far end and observed her from a distance. She looked at the cat. The cat looked at her with the same profound and particular indifference as this morning, and offered nothing and asked nothing, which was, she thought, its own form of useful. Gerald died at 4:17 in the afternoon. Ssyven was in the doorway because she could not decide whether to enter, and then found the time had resolved the question. She was in the doorway and she stayed there. It was quiet. There was no machinery in conflict, no dramatic alteration of the atmosphere. The light through the window had moved to the late afternoon angle, longer, warmer, the particular gold of an autumn day just before it concedes to evening. And it lay across the bed and across Margaret's hand, and across Gerald's, and Ssyven stood in the doorway and watched something she did not have a word for. The Velthari Collective processed death sufficiently. She had always considered this a kindness, to the individual, to the family, to the collective's ongoing function. 40 minutes, sometimes less, and then the affairs were concluded and the collective carried forward, and the grief, which was considered a form of cognitive static, was not permitted to colonize the present. Her mother had been transferred 3 years ago. The process had taken 43 minutes. Ssyven had been preparing for a diplomatic conference in another system and had not returned in time. There had been no particular expectation that she should. She had received the administrative confirmation and filed it and continued with the conference, which had gone well, and she had considered herself, at the time, to be managing the situation correctly. She stood in the doorway of room 7 and thought about this. With complete involuntary clarity, for the first time in 3 years, her Velthis filaments were exposed, fully, unprofessionally, irretrievably. They had extended at some point in the last 20 minutes, and she had not noticed until now, and she could not pull them back. They rested along the line of her jaw, registering the air of the room, the antiseptic and the warmth and something else she did not have a category for. But her body apparently did. Her chest plate had cycled through 3 colors she had not produced since adolescence. She was aware that she was doing all of this, and she could not stop any of it. Margaret stayed another 30 minutes. She spoke quietly to Benedita, signed a small form that was brought to her, made 2 brief calls from her personal device in the corridor, and then she cried, not catastrophically, not as a performance, not as a collapse. She leaned against the wall in the hallway outside room 7 and cried for perhaps 3 minutes, with a packet of tissues she had kept in her vest pocket, and it was absolutely clear to Ssyven that this pocket and these tissues had been there every Tuesday for 11 years. Margaret caught her watching. She did not look embarrassed. She blew her nose with practical competence and said, "Right. Room 12 will be wondering where I've got to." She straightened her vest. She walked. Ssyven did not follow immediately. She stood alone in the corridor and looked, for the first time all day, at what was around her. Not cataloging, not annotating, simply looking, the way she suspected she had not looked at anything in quite some time. The children's drawings, a finger-painted sun in the corner of one, slightly lopsided, deeply committed. The sign, "Every person here is someone's everything." The notice board cartoon that was not funny, but that someone had thought was, and had pinned up anyway and no one had taken down. The long window light across the floor. She looked at all of it. She wrote nothing. The cat had followed her and was now sitting at the end of the corridor, watching with the same assessment as this morning and this afternoon, and Ssyven looked at it and understood, in some way she could not annotate, that the cat was not judging her and was not impressed by her and was not recording her, was simply present with her in this particular moment, for no reason anyone had assigned. She was still standing there when Margaret found her in the entrance foyer 20 minutes later, moving toward the exit. Ssyven had her recording equipment organized and her coat retrieved and her annotation document saved and closed, and she was, she believed, ready to conclude the observation and return to the delegation quarters to compile her assessment. Margaret asked, "How are you doing?" Not as a social formula, not as the ritualized opener Ssyven had classified in her first week of Earth posting as Category 2, Human Greeting Protocol, minimal response expected. Margaret used the question the way she apparently used everything, directly and with genuine interest in the answer, which made it a completely different question. Ssyven opened her mouth to give the professional response. The words were there, she had used them 10,000 times, and then they simply weren't. Something about the quality of Margaret's attention dissolved them. She said, "I have been in this facility for 6 hours. She stopped. She tried again with the careful deliberateness of someone constructing a sentence in a language they have just realized they have been mispronouncing. "I came here with a classification system for behavior, for what sapient beings do and why and what it means. I have been using it for 14 years, and I have." She stopped again. Her manipulator arms were moving. She let them. "I have been wrong," she said, "about something. I cannot tell you with complete precision what it was, because I am still determining the shape of it, but I know it is significant, and I know I was wrong about it before today, and I am not certain I was the only one." Margaret listened without interrupting. This was, Ssyven thought, its own form of extraordinary, to receive an incomplete and uncertain thing and simply hold it without correcting it or completing it. After a moment, Margaret said, "You know what I've learned from this job?" She said it without preamble, without the rhetorical lift that usually preceded a conclusion. The ones who can't sit still with sadness. It's not because they're cold. It's because nobody ever showed them it was survivable. The entrance foyer was quiet. The evening light was almost gone, and the facility's interior lights had the warm, specific quality of rooms that are trying to be gentle. Ssyven said, "I think my civilization may have made a decision a long time ago about what we could afford to feel, and I think today I may have seen the cost of it." Margaret looked at her for a moment, not with pity, not with the particular compassion that Ssyven would have found difficult to receive, but with something simpler, recognition, as if Ssyven had said something true that Margaret had known was there, waiting. "Good night," Margaret said. "Take care of yourself." She went back inside. Ssyven stood in the entrance foyer and felt the resonance skip come again, the second tone, unprofessional and unscheduled and entirely hers. This time she did not reach to suppress it. She let it sound, faint and real, and then she walked out into the evening. The diplomatic quarters were quiet. Ambassador Rel Kotha had sent 2 messages while she was in transit, both polite, both containing the phrase, "looking forward to the preliminary assessment," both representing a version of herself she was not, at this precise moment, certain she could locate. She sat at her workstation. She opened the official cultural assessment template. She read the categories: social function, reciprocal exchange, status conferral, ritual, efficacy. She read them slowly, with the same complete attention she had given everything today. Category 4C, voluntary interaction of low reciprocal utility, the category she had been reaching for all morning, the one that had never quite closed around what she was seeing. She sat with the template for a long time. She had used this template 112 times in 14 years of cultural work. She could complete it efficiently. She had always been able to complete it efficiently. She knew the language, knew the weights, knew exactly how to render an observed behavior into a portable, transmissible, professionally credible document that her superiors could file and reference and act upon. She thought about Gerald's hand in Margaret's hand. She thought about the specific gravity of 2 sugars added without asking, of a joke that wasn't very good, of tissues kept in a vest pocket every Tuesday for 11 years. She closed the template. She opened a blank document, unofficial, unformatted, nothing about it belonging to any standard diplomatic framework. Her Velthari filaments were still extended. She had stopped trying to retract them somewhere on the transit home, and she found, sitting in the quiet of her quarters, that she did not especially want to. They registered the air of the room. The room was still. It had its own texture, its own quiet. Nothing like the hospice, nothing like the gold light through the window in room 7. But a quiet she was choosing to be inside rather than working through. She began to write. "I observed a human named Margaret Calloway today for 6 hours. I cannot complete the standard assessment. The behavior I witnessed does not fit any existing Velthari category for sapient action, not because it is irrational, but because our categories were built to exclude it." She paused. Her manipulator arms were still. She thought about her mother. She thought about 43 minutes in a conference that had gone well. "I believe this exclusion was a choice our civilization made. I do not know when. I am not certain we understood at the time what we were giving up." She looked at this sentence for a long time. It was the most professionally dangerous sentence she had ever written. It was also, she believed, the most accurate. She added the last lines. She held his hand. "He did not die alone. I am attempting to determine why I believe this to be the most important thing I have observed in 14 years of cultural work. I will submit a full report when I have the correct words. I do not currently have them." She saved the document. The cursor blinked in the empty space below the last line, waiting for more, and she had nothing more, not yet, not tonight. But she did not close it. She left it open on the screen, visible, the sentences sitting in the light. She turned off the work lamp. She sat in the dark of her quarters in a chair that was not designed for Velthari ergonomics and was faintly uncomfortable. And she did not move toward sleep, and did not return to the template, and did not compose a message to Ambassador Rel Kotha. She sat, and the night was quiet, and the document glowed faintly on the screen, its few plain sentences, its unfinished quality, its honesty. She thought about Margaret straightening her vest and going to room 12. She thought about Dottie and her crossword book, and the cat at the end of the corridor, and the finger-painted sun in the corner of a child's drawing, slightly lopsided, absolutely committed. She thought about a woman who had been coming to this building every Tuesday for 11 years, not because anyone required it, not because it conferred any status her civilization would recognize, not because the math resolved into a net positive, but because she had decided a long time ago to be the kind of person who came. Ssyven sat in the dark for a long time. She was not processing. She was not compiling. She was not efficiently managing the emotional data of the day toward a productive output. She was just sitting. Perhaps, she thought, that was enough. Perhaps it was more than enough. Perhaps it was, in fact, the whole of it. Just this. Just being here, in the quiet, in the dark, for no reason except that she was still capable of it. Whatever her civilization had decided 300 years ago, in whatever room that decision had been made, she thought about the cost of it now. She thought about all the hands that had not been held, and all the rooms that had been left too quickly, and all the efficient silences where something else might have been allowed to live. Her Velthari filaments rested against her jaw, open, private, no one watching. She stayed.